Make sure. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We have about 18 of us in the room. Room is filling up quickly. And just while we're waiting for others, if you could please, while we're waiting, just introduce yourselves into chat. Let us know where you're connecting from in the world. I'm connecting from Portugal, nearly 31 degrees here today, so aircon it is. I can see Marta nodding. Let us know where you're connecting from in the world, what's the weather like where you are, and feel free to rename yourselves as well. Into Zoom, you see there's three dots on the top right of your screen where you can add your schools as well. Uh, how many of us? We have 21 of us, so should be good to kick off. Daniel, Eric? All right.
Yep, I think so. Welcome everybody. So I'm Eric Bergemann, Managing Director of Executive Education at the MIT Sloan School of Management, member of the UNICON Board, and a co-chair of the UNICON Research Committee this year. So I have been involved in the research that Daniel is going to speak about here. Before we start, I just want to bring in something very important, which we do in front of all of our UNICON presentations, meetings, events, and that is to just remind everybody of our antitrust policy at UNICON. So the antitrust policy is in place. UNICON is a U.S. nonprofit, and we operate under the laws of the United States as an association of business schools, organizations that are in the same field. We need to be mindful of and follow the antitrust guidelines in the United States federal law. Antitrust is designed to promote competition, and UNICON, as all of you know, is very much in favor of competition in our field. We also are opposed to anti-competitive behavior. And so things which are considered anti-competitive behavior that we do not engage in are to talk about how we price our offerings, how we compensate people. Those topics are not proper for conversation amongst members. So if we follow those guidelines, it's greatly appreciated and very important, UNICON. Okay, so I would like to introduce a valued partner to UNICON, Daniel Chadwick. Many of you have met Daniel at UNICON conferences over time. Daniel is a co-founder of NextEd, which is an organization that focuses on research in the executive education space. You may also know Daniel from IEDP. NextEd is the research branch of IEDP. He has over a decade of working with top business schools worldwide, really focuses on the dynamics issues that are taking place in a rapidly changing field. So is quite knowledgeable about us. He has a global perspective. Daniel and his co-founder, Patrick Lejoncourt, worked with us over the past year on a project about the demand side of education for artificial intelligence. And I see Patrick. Hi, Patrick. Great to see you. Patrick is Daniel's co-founder and co-collaborator in this particular project. And so when they came to us with the idea, came to the research committee with the idea for a project on AI and talked about what are our customers thinking about in AI, would we be interested in a project on that? We said yes very quickly, because this is probably the biggest issue for most of us right now in our work. So Daniel is going to take us through an overview of the research project. I think many, if not most of you, have downloaded that. We encourage you to put questions into the chat. We're going to have a Q&A toward the end of the session here. Daniel, I think you're planning on pretty much going along with the presentation, but we may take some pauses to field some of the questions, and I'll be managing that process as well. Unless there are any questions, I'm very happy to turn the floor over to Daniel at this point. Welcome, my friend.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eric. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. And I just want to say a quick thank you really to UNICON at the top here for their partnership, as Eric says, not just on this research, but also for being kind of so supportive of what we've created with NextEd since we launched the research arm of IADP 18 months or so ago now. So as Eric says, NextEd is the research arm of IADP. So Patrick and I set this up, to really generate data and insights in this space between the client side and the provider side of business education. We've always had networks on both those sides, and NextEd is really our attempt to bridge information across the two sides, and to hopefully inform better partnerships and innovation. But as I say, UNICON's been an amazing partner for us, with particularly how they've got behind NextEd. So a big thank you to Melanie and also to Eric and Alan Chen as well, who both contributed a lot to this. So what I'll share today, this research, as Eric says, it's about how organizations are experiencing AI transformation and the implications of that for you guys really, but for the future of learning. I'm going to share some of the most eye-catching insights from the report, but the full report is hugely rich and packed with intriguing insights, I would say. So if this piques your interest, really do download that, and you can go a lot deeper into the research. So let's get into it here. So with this research, what we wanted to do, what makes this a little bit different for us, is that we wanted to move kind of closer to the front line of transformation. So not so much the CLOs and talent leaders that we typically focus our research on. And the learning function is still incredibly important to us, of course, but learning leaders and we all do this. I think you can jump quite quickly to thinking about solutions and what skills do we need, rather than exploring the nature of the challenge itself. So with this project, we decided to speak directly with transformation leaders, technology leaders, folks who are really doing the work of AI transformation in practice, and to understand where are organizations with transformation, what challenges are emerging, and what do they make of the learning that's on offer in this area, and what does it all mean for you guys? So there's a little snapshot there of who we spoke to. The first thing I'll share, and maybe you saw this on social that was shared yesterday, I think, but this is really useful for context and might be somewhat surprising. But so one of the things we found here was that, yes, organizations are using a broad mix of providers, perhaps not surprising. I think this is a fairly typical mix of provider types, but what jumps out is this large share of work with technology partners. So organizations relying on their technology partners for learning. And then the other thing that jumps out for this audience will be that the business school share is relatively small at sort of 17%. So yeah, big share using tech partners. That means people like Google, AWS, OpenAI and others as a source of learning. And so, yeah, usually in a market share within exec ed, the technology partners like that they might be there, but they wouldn't show up nearly so prominently as this. So this is new. But speaking with the leaders, as we did with our interviews, speaking with these technology leaders, you can see the logic and how this kind of came to be. So organizations are forging these big partnerships with technology firms, and along with the tech itself comes a lot of training, wraparound support around that to help them adopt those tools and technologies. And as the partnership scales, they've kind of become embedded as a training partner, and the scope of what they're asking of the training partner grows and kind of gets into the territory more of these learning needs, because they're coming up with all these different needs that are maybe outside of the tools. So yeah, I know this jumped out to Eric and others, the fact that much of the learning market in this area is being served by what we would call sort of non-traditional providers at the moment. So something else that surprised us, and my insights here are grouped into sort of three groups roughly. This is the first one, is around this finding that we had that despite all the uncertainty surrounding AI and business, the leaders that we spoke with were really much clearer than we maybe expected in terms of where they are today, where they're headed, and what they need to get them there. So here's a quote from someone that I think really captures this well. The challenge is moving from functional optimization to cognitive systems thinking. And this was former CTO at FedEx. He was part of a really remarkable success story of FedEx that you may have read about. They've been kind of really betting big on AI and logistics, but this guy, spoke really brilliantly and vividly about the subject, and there's lots of his quotes in the report that I'd encourage you to kind of seek out. But this general idea that he's getting at came across really strongly through lots of the interviews and in the survey as well. So that organizations are sort of struggling to move beyond using AI to optimize what they're already doing, and getting to the point where they're applying AI to whole systems and whole businesses. So they're getting very good at functioning as these high-performing but still siloed teams. And these CTOs are saying, really, to unlock the real value of transformation, the company needs to kind of blow the walls down and work as a sort of integrated whole. Cognitive systems thinking was his phrase, but other people had other phrases for it, but they were largely kind of driving at that same thing. And that's where they thought the real promise of AI transformation really was. And so when you start to think of this, I think this has huge implications for the organization as a whole, strategy, data, how's work designed, how's work structured, leadership, and therefore all that applies to learning as well. How do you serve those issues and challenges as learning providers? And I think this is what I meant on the previous slide, where I said there's more clarity emerging. And so when I sort of read a quote like this, I don't hear uncertainty. I think this is a fairly clear articulation of where we are today and where we need to get to. And what's interesting to me and to this audience, I think, is that these ideas around de-siloing and systems thinking, which are really very much traditional business school territory, they're sort of coming back to the fore. So that was from the interviews. This is some evidence from our survey that sort of supports this same idea. 81%, you can see there, using AI to optimize existing processes. only 24% believe that's where the real value or the future value really lies. Instead, it's this more diverse set of more sort of systems level applications of AI, new ways of working, new operating models. That's sort of the promise of the future of AI. What can it unlock? So I think you can see the FedEx quote here, the sort of functional optimization on one side, and things that look more like what I would call, or what FedEx might call cognitive systems thinking on the right here, sort of playing out in these numbers. Another element is there is this realization that many organizations just aren't particularly well set up to simply parachute in this new technology, and we might all have been experiencing something like this, but just sort of dropping AI on top of your current ways of working and hoping for good results hasn't seemed to have borne much fruit over the last 12 months or so. And kind of more than that, we heard in interviews that not only is it unlikely to unlock value, it may actually amplify existing inefficiencies and fragmentation in your organization. Only 16% strongly agree that they're well set up to maximize the benefits of AI. So again, the way the challenge is being experienced is much more strategic. It's about redesigning the organization, not simply adopting AI, as we may have been possibly thinking about it more recently. They're wrestling with these questions about how are decisions made in this new kind of reality, how data is shared, how functions should connect better. And so for me, this is a much more compelling set of challenges for business schools, specifically to kind of sink their teeth into and help with, perhaps more so than pure technology adoption, which is a bit more limited in scope. And not every organization is thinking this way. Plenty will be happy with optimizing, getting really efficient at what they do. That will always be the case. But this is, for the firms that are really have these ambitious transformation goals, this is kind of how they're looking at it. So you can see this in this data as well. We've got top challenges on the left and what are the top capabilities we need on the right. You can see strategy and organizational design number 2, challenges, and right at the top for top capabilities, strategic thinking. So I think that the bigger story here is probably that there's strong demand in lots of these areas, like everything below strategy. And we'll go into some of this in some of the next slides. But I think what I wanted to call out here was that this sort of important thread that there's this really strong signal of leaders calling for strategy or support around strategy. So let's look at some of those, sort of zoom in on some of those other capabilities there. So we touched on strategic thinking as the top one, but we're also seeing strong demand for adaptability, cross-functional collaboration, critical thinking, change management. So I want to just unpack some of these a little bit. The report goes much deeper on these, but sort of to connect this with what we were hearing from the interviews. So firstly, on adaptability, something that may resonate here is the idea of skills fatigue. When you work on a new technical skill, only for it to be sort of overtaken quite quickly, and you're asked to develop a new skill and so on, and it kind of becomes a cycle. That's something that I think a lot of us have been experiencing. Something like prompt engineering is maybe an example that people will find familiar. A year or so ago, everyone was saying this is probably the most important thing you can learn in AI. Now, because of certain advances in how models work, those techniques are a bit less valuable, perhaps. So I think this is why something like adaptability and agility comes in so high here. The ability to pick up and sort of quickly understand a new approach and pivot between them is being prioritized, I would say, over deep expertise in some of these more technical areas. So the other one I want to kind of unpack a bit is cross-functional collaboration at number 3 there, because this was a really strong theme throughout the research, really. It was a top 3 capability, as we saw, but also really interesting to me, it was the number one selection criteria for learning partners was the ability for learning partners to work across functions. So delivering learning across the business and helping to promote that sort of de-siloing that we spoke about. A couple of quotes here that sort of illustrate this. It's about bringing people together from levels. Now you can clearly see the network, the meta view. This was another really great interview. She's the CLO of the US Air Force, excellent communicator. She's a really strong advocate of business schools, actually. And yeah, we shouldn't have favorites, but she was one of my favorites. And then it's not just delivering knowledge, it's about shared learning. So these are just kind of a few snippets, but I think what I see here is a potentially really significant opportunity for executive education where convening people together from across the organization could be really powerful to solve problems together, to share learning, perhaps drawing expertise from different parts of the university. These are things that I would say business schools are sort of uniquely well set up to do and to help facilitate that sort of meta view that this CLO was talking about here. This is another sort of encouraging slide, I would say, for today's audience, in that what we found is many of the capabilities that organizations are asking for line up really nicely with what they think, what they perceive business schools to be strong on, to be sort of well set up to deliver. I think sort of 4 of the top 5 there overlap. And you might ask, well, why are we only being used by 17% of them then? Which is what Alan Chen asked me this, and I didn't have a good answer for him. But I think that probably needs its own survey to maybe dig into. But I think what I find interesting here is that this is an interesting sort of counter to some of the bleaker narratives about AI and learning. That here there seems to be really strong demand in areas where business schools are traditionally played really well, and so those things line up well for me for business schools. So probably the biggest capability gap is something we haven't touched upon yet, and that's AI literacy. Ranked as the number 1 challenge, you would have seen on one of the previous slides, 87% believe strong or very strong AI literacy is required to achieve their goals. Only 9% currently rate their literacy levels as very strong, so a significant gap. But the sort of difficulty here that came through in the interviews is that asking for AI literacy is a lot easier than delivering AI literacy, and it's something business schools are probably know very well. But it's not a case of becoming literate in the same way that you might become data literate or finance literate, and those skills really standing the test of time for quite a long period of time. This is more about staying literate in a subject that is evolving kind of on a daily basis. So a very different challenge. You could have a foundational level AI literacy type offering or intervention. But over time, the question is sort of how do we sustain literacy as the goalposts kind of keep moving? And that's probably one of the reasons we see, that there's a lot of pressure on the current learning models that are, being used by these leaders. Here's a few data points that kind of illustrate that. Just 15% say their current learning needs are being met very well. 46% say existing formats struggle to keep pace. 44% current learning is too generic. Quite high numbers, really. So a good deal of sort of dissatisfaction, I would say, on what is on offer. And this was supported with what we heard with the interviews. I would say this is particularly targeted at learning formats like online learning, sort of LMS type content. And, don't forget that a large share of the learning that was going on here was with technology providers as well, and only a small share was with business schools. And I should also say that where folks were using business schools in our interviews, at least the perception and the story was really positive. But I mean, this I think does, it tells its own story. And on the other side, we see, what are leaders asking for? We see strong appetite for things like continuous learning, strong appetite for learning integrated with work, strong appetite for learning delivered across functions again. So I think, what comes across here is that organizations are aware that AI is not a sort of linear subject. It's a dynamic one. And what they're finding is that these sort of front-loaded knowledge acquisition type offerings is not enough for what they want to do. And we see more of what I would call these adaptive types of learning. That's what I'm sort of grouping these modes of learning under. But so by that, I mean learning that has kind of feedback loops and it progresses it's more cyclical, more application, more space for experimentation. These types of formats, I think, are really much better equipped for this subject. Another big gap here, probably the most striking one, was around experimentation. And I think this, is really relevant for business schools. So 86% say hands-on experimentation very or extremely important for building AI capabilities. Only 8% say they've got the time and space to experiment effectively. So clearly people understand the need to get hands-on with AI. But right now, as probably many of us feel, we don't have enough time in the day, perhaps, to play around with sort of non-critical tasks. And these CTOs and leaders were saying that's exactly what you need to do in learning around this. But they lack the space and opportunity to do it. So I would ask, can business schools provide that for them? Lastly, something we always focus on with NextEd, and it was kind of the main subject of our previous report and will continue to be something we really focus on, is how does this affect learning partnerships? So not just what programs can we design in response to these signals, perhaps, but how does this affect what good partnering between client and provider looks like? And really interesting findings here, I think. So the key thing that came through was that organizations understand that their learning partners are kind of learning as they go themselves, just like they are. And consequently, there's an openness to the idea that not every piece of learning in this space is going to be kind of road tested and bulletproof and have a kind of case study of how it's been used before. In fact, 76% are comfortable with offerings that are experimental or evolving or not fully defined. And over 70% would like to collaborate direct with their learning partner on a live AI project. So there's clear appetite for learning that kind of evolves alongside the challenges of AI. I think this suggests to me partnerships that are more collaborative in the future, with more experimentation and more kind of co-generation of knowledge and practice, which is something that came across in these interviews being asked for really directly. So, I see this as a positive signal, I would say, because I think sometimes we have the impression that our clients kind of want everything to be perfect already and kind of want it last week already. But here they're saying, we understand this is difficult. Let's collaborate, which I think sets the stage for a much healthier kind of partnership. So, do download the full report. There's so much more in there in terms of kind of depth and richness. But just to kind of wrap up, I think, hopefully what's come across there is this is somewhat of a counter to that uncertainty narrative that kind of surrounds AI. I think there's more clarity and more realism from these leaders than we assumed there would be going in about where they are and what they need from learning. I think the biggest takeaway for me is not to view AI as a technology challenge primarily, but as a kind of all-encompassing business challenge. And for me, that makes a much more interesting opportunity for executive education. And with that, ready for questions or however you want to go, Eric.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Daniel. So, colleagues, if you've got a question and want to put forth to Daniel, Zoom hand raises would be great. Who would like to go first? Seeing no hand raised, I've got a couple of questions at the outset here. Daniel, in the course of the interviews and the analysis that you and Patrick were doing, it's really pretty striking that you see the needs that people are looking for now are things that business schools are, we think, generally pretty good at, around strategic thinking and being agile and adaptive and thinking in a cross-functional way in large organizations. And then you look at the data and say, well, so far, 17.2% of people have worked with business schools. Did you get what was the sense that you got in these interviews of, are people now looking, two questions really, are people now really looking at business schools? And what do business schools have to do to attract more attention? What do you think they have have to do from the standpoint of proof points to their clients?
Yeah, great. I mean, I knew you were going to ask me this, Eric, and it's kind of the big question. But I think what it says to me perhaps is that, don't forget this. So this is the transformation function. This is the technology function. This is where they're at with this issue. This is how they're seeing it. Now, has that filtered through yet to the learning function in terms of being, trying new things, having a broader mix of learning providers, which maybe would then include business schools for organizations that weren't yet using them. One thing that we did find was, so we did a segmentation on how mature a respondent was in AI in terms of how it was kind of a composite of how someone responded to three or four questions about their organization's set up around AI, including their strategy and their structure. How confident were they in it? And we turned that into a segment of higher or lower AI maturity level. So we could kind of see if someone scored noughts and ones and twos on those questions, they were a little bit further behind. Fours and fives, we called them. So it was sort of a loose directional segment. When we looked at that, you can see that higher AI maturity were using more business scores. They were using more of everyone. They were kind of the more advanced firms had decided to or decided they needed a broader mix of learning providers. So I think that would be one of my answers here is that if you see this as a kind of timeline, at some point, these realizations are happening. They're finding current learning provision lacking in certain areas. They're thinking, who else can meet these different needs? And I would say that's, you look at how flipping that around, I would say to exec ed, that's a nice way of thinking, can I identify some clients who are here on that timeline and are ready for me? And that might help them with who to approach or how to approach.
Yeah, great. You said something which I think is interesting there, which is not just using more business schools, but using more of everybody, which seems to me to be consistent with the idea that the learning and education needs don't go. It's not that you get level on technology and you say, okay, now I'm ready to talk about the organizational stuff and development stuff, but the technological capabilities are changing all the time as well, and so you can't just stop and say, well, we already figured out how to use ChatGPT or Copilot, right? But now you've got to think about Claude Focus or something. I think that also winds in. Cheryl Bates had a question in the chat here, maybe building a little on something Shalini said to this question of AI literacy. I don't know, Cheryl, if you want to come off mute here, maybe just your question.
Yeah, I was just curious, what are leaders expecting their teams to know when it comes to literacy? Is that something that you talk to them about? Because is it, like you said, is it knowing prompts? Is it like, what is the depth of knowledge they're wanting their teams to know when it comes to AI literacy?
Yeah, brilliant. So this was this was an area that I think deserves its own piece of research, really, to kind of, and I don't think it's going to be an easy job of defining a kind of capability around AI literacy because it's so dynamic and because it changes all the time. But what we did pick up is that leaders think that AI literacy could be a kind of skeleton key for lots of the other issues that they're facing, kind of workforce resistance, slow decision making, all these issues the CTOs feel are due to a lack of AI literacy at all sorts of levels that are holding up the progress. And in terms of what that meant for them, they wanted their colleagues to have a view of kind of the history of AI, how we got to this point, which I thought was quite interesting. So that would be one part of it. So not thinking of AI as a kind of black box, but sort of knowing a little bit about how we got here. Certainly, there's a sort of vocabulary terminology piece where it came up that just the term AI can be a unhelpfully broad umbrella term, and it'll mean different things to different people. But for lots of us, it kind of means GPT models first, because that's what we might be, what most people are kind of playing with. But there's obviously lots of other different types of AI that are being explored here. And so having a more finer set of vocab that and definitions that everyone knows, and then could be a kind of shared language. I think that would be a powerful piece in an organization. And again, that's an ongoing piece, right? Because you can get quickly left behind in something like that as it all moves on. So hopefully that answered that somewhat.
Good. Thanks, Daniel. Shalini has her hand up. Shalini, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Daniel. Thank you so much for the presentation. I would be curious from the interviews you had, was there anything that anyone spoke to about what was working around adoption and behavioral change that we can think about as we design and deliver these types of programs?
So adoption and what's happened to my
Behavioral change.
yes. Can you hear me? My
Yes.
okay, good. So in terms of what's in these interviews, one thing we didn't have, we had more in the realm of what wasn't working and what are our bugbears and why isn't it working, I must say, than stories of how this is great, this really is working. Some of the more bullish descriptions of what they were doing that came through involved a kind of sort of an at all levels approach where all levels of the organization from top to bottom had been taken through some kind of AI training, and it will have had different flavors and levels, I suppose. But everyone was it wasn't just given to the line workers, and it wasn't just given to the top leadership, but sort of everything in between had gone through some kind of AI piece, and that was, that tended to be delivered with a mix of different providers as well. So one that kind of comes to mind was, involved Accenture. It involved at least one business school. It involved a lot of their internal training. But then they'd managed to make that cohesive and make that one. And they were very pleased with the results there. Yeah, I think the other thing possibly that I might point to is I came across some of these CTOs. The FedEx person was an example. The US Air Force was an example where they were really kind of visionary people that had a great way of talking about this that made it really easy for me to understand. I'm not an AI expert, but I could understand exactly what they meant. And the way they spoke about these things was just very articulate, eloquent, vivid. And if you've got those people, I think in an area of complexity like that, that could be huge, hugely beneficial for getting the message across and having that shared understanding.
I think that also speaks to something which business schools are generally pretty good at around communication, leadership, prioritization, and connecting that. So that's would be another point for as we think about things that where we can really make a contribution is good. Junaid has interesting point, particularly since we are the university consortium of executive education, although we are certainly dominated by business school perspectives, but university also means collaboration across. Junaid, I don't know if you might want to say a little bit about, you have a comment in the chat about collaboration with engineering.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I just wanted to comment following your remarks. I mean, as you might recall, maybe you don't, but at Sabancı, the executive education is a centralized unit. It's not part of the business school. We operate representing the whole university, which consists of three different faculties or schools, business school being one of them. So by definition, we have direct access to engineering school, business school, and social sciences at the same time. And when this whole surge began about more or less 10 years ago, at least that's when it hit the Turkish corporate agenda, to develop analytical academies and stuff like that. Obviously, the business school had the knowledge or the foundation in terms of the strategy and leadership and all that, but there also needed to be a bridging knowledge base connecting the technological side. And we started cooperating with faculty from the engineering school, particularly computer engineering, and it teamed them up with business faculty and created programs that was actually a bundling of topics, semi-technical, not hardcore. I mean, hardcore technical is something else, obviously, but that bridging enabled us to really develop very impactful programs that kind of expanded significantly. So we were lucky to do that. It might be much easier for us because, as I said, we operate directly within that kind of a scope. So, I mean, deans are our peers, if you want to put it in that sense. So, and that may be harder if when the exec shop is part of the business school specifically and to reach out to engineering, which is the case in many universities. But apparently, the corporate side really appreciated that. So they did not want either a business or an engineering faculty. They wanted both because each one provided or complemented each other from their distinctive perspectives. And now with AI, I think it's becoming more, and I think it's now expanding into the College of Arts. I would say to keep in mind, because with AI, it's more important. The content is becoming relatively less important to learn about because AI can provide that, but it's more about how the brain functions and how people think. It's focusing more on the thinking process, which takes us to psychology and neuroscience and other areas. So the collaboration outside the business school, I think, is going to become pretty fundamental going forward. I mean, I took maybe a bit too much airtime, Eric, but I mean, that's how I'm kind of bringing things together. And
No,
then
I think
no, I think
cognitive
that's
processing. That's what this is. So
yeah.
I think that's fascinating and completely on the money in terms of what we were hearing from these leaders, and I think that's exactly where this is going in terms of what's being asked for. And I think you're right. I think schools that are well set up to do that will have an advantage in doing that. But I think it's just these. This is what everyone is finding. These challenges are not going to be solved in silos. They're cross-functional by nature. You're not going to have, oh, I'm going to solve it in finance, I'm going to solve it in marketing. And then people that are doing that are not going to get hugely very, very far. The program that you described is a great example of that, I think, of how can you bring different people together and then bring expertise together that matches that. Wow, I mean, that could just be hugely powerful, I think.
I think something you said toward the end there, Sinead, about the connections between cognitive functions and artificial intelligence is one of the real accelerants over the last 10 to 15 years of AI models, particularly around the transitions from machine learning to deep learning models, which are the direct descendants of large language models. For many years that you had to be a data scientist or a computer scientist to do this work, but now it's on our desktops, right? So, but all of those influences, I think, are one of the aspects that makes these technologies more accessible to us, and more in the forefront of things where now we all need to think about these things. So that's great. Thank you, Sinead. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Laurier, you want to come off mic? I see a question in the chat that you have.
Yes, hi, this is Laurier from Montreal. I read an article from a researcher who was telling about artificial intelligence. That is sorry, it's not no longer a technological challenge, but more a leadership challenge. His view was, I thought I agree with that regarding business school. How can we train more the executive people to decide how to use AI and what's the value and more the strategic thinking, because the technological part that you mentioned in your survey is more taken care of by the service providers. What is your take on this, and how can we leverage that as a business school? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what what's really interesting here is that what you were just saying there about firms are sort of almost outsourcing the technical side to their technology partners. I think this is true, but what we found there is that there's this tension between the more that they outsource to their technology partners, the less ownership and direction they have over increasingly some sort of elements of the whole business. So it's not just the technology. When these functions are so crucial to the business, if they outsource too much of it and they haven't got any of those skills in house, then they've lost control over it. So they're having these really difficult situations where are we becoming over reliant on our technology partners? So there's that part. So um, there's this whole debate going on within these organizations about what should we be outsourcing, what actually do we need to be insourcing, or bringing in house that we didn't used to do, for example. And the other thing is that some of the data I shared earlier about the fact that technical AI skills were sort of looking like they were being deprioritized. That isn't to say that they're not sorely in need. It was more that there is this sort of skills fatigue, and with that people are looking for another way through, rather than just continually throwing training money and training time on learning the skills themselves. So they're no less important, and how you get that talent and how you get those skills into the business is still hugely important. But it's almost like you say, the leadership issue has superseded it and has now said, well, this is kind of a bigger problem, and we need this strategic view to answer some of these big thorny issues around how are we going to partner with different suppliers and things like that, and what are the risks of getting in too deep with some of them.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laurier. Thank you, Daniel. One more question, if we have one. Nope. I know we're near the top of the hour. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just want to make a couple of quick points here. Having the webinars on our research projects now is something that we're looking to do. Was that prime reps have asked for this? You've asked for this. The reports are great, and that's one way to get messages across, but also being able to have conversations around them is really important. And so we're really glad that Daniel was available today to do that, and that you joined us. So thank you very much. There will be more in the future as UNICON releases more research projects. We have several that are underway now. We also are at the annual workshop next month. We're going to do a little bit of a drill down on one aspect of the report that we didn't talk about today, that has some direct implications for business schools, which is addressed as the 6 tensions in the report for those of you who have downloaded it. But we'll cover this again in person as well. Daniele, anything else that you'd like to share at this point?
No, thank you so much, Eric. Just to say, I'm afraid the annual workshop, which is great news for us, but there is a waiting list. So have a look on the event section of the website if you'd like to join the wait list. But don't despair. If you can't get into these events, there will be also the Team Development Conference in November, and we'll release details on that soon. So that's coming up as well. Thank you so much, Eric. Daniel learns a lot today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Daniele, and thanks to everybody who joined us today. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.